Blade 2 arrived in 2002 with a cast that helped transform what could have been a straightforward comic book sequel into a distinctive mixture of action, horror, martial arts, and character-driven conflict. At the center was Wesley Snipes, returning as Eric Brooks, better known as Blade. By this point, Snipes had already spent more than a decade establishing himself as one of Hollywood's most versatile leading men. His earlier career included acclaimed dramatic work in films such as New Jack City and Jungle Fever, alongside major action pictures including Passenger 57, Demolition Man, Drop Zone, and U.S. Marshals. The first Blade had given him something different, a character who combined his screen presence, physical ability, martial arts experience, and controlled acting style into one recognizable cinematic hero. In Blade 2, Snipes appears completely comfortable with the character. Blade rarely needs long speeches to establish authority. His posture, movements, facial expressions, and deliberate delivery communicate confidence and danger. Snipes also had a major creative investment in the sequel as one of its producers. His martial arts background remained essential to the film's identity, allowing Blade's combat scenes to feel like an extension of the character rather than simply action sequences inserted into the story. The sequel further cemented Blade as one of Snipes' defining roles. At a time before superhero movies became Hollywood's dominant blockbuster genre, Snipes had created a comic book character whose appearance, weapons, fighting style, sunglasses, and attitude were immediately identifiable. Kristofferson returned as Abraham Whistler, Blade's mentor, weapons expert, and closest approximation to a father figure. Kristofferson already possessed an extraordinary career before entering the Blade series. He had become famous as a singer and songwriter before developing an extensive acting career, appearing in films such as Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, A Star Is Born, and Convoy. By the time of Blade 2, his weathered appearance and naturally rough voice made him ideal for Whistler. He brought credibility to a character who might otherwise have existed merely to provide weapons and exposition. The relationship between Snipes and Kristofferson also gives Blade 2 an important emotional foundation. Blade is usually distant from everyone around him, but Whistler can challenge him in ways that other characters cannot. Kristofferson plays the role with sarcasm, toughness, and exhaustion, suggesting a man who has spent years living inside a violent hidden war. His return also strengthened continuity with the first movie and ensured that Blade still had a human connection beneath his almost invincible exterior. Ron Perlman joined the sequel as Dieter Reinhardt, one of the most aggressive members of the Blood Pack. Perlman was already deeply associated with fantasy and genre filmmaking. His career included Quest for Fire, The Name of the Rose, and the television series Beauty and the Beast, while his earlier collaboration with director Guillermo del Toro in Cronos had begun an important professional relationship. Perlman's imposing physical presence and unmistakable voice made Reinhardt an effective rival for Blade. He plays the character as arrogant, hostile, and permanently eager for confrontation. Blade 2 became another important chapter in Perlman's long association with del Toro. Only 2 years later, the director would cast him as the title character in Hellboy, a role that became one of Perlman's most famous performances. Looking back, Reinhardt almost feels like a bridge between Perlman's earlier genre work and the period when he became one of the most recognizable faces in modern fantasy cinema. Leonor Varela plays Nyssa Damaskinos, daughter of the vampire ruler Eli Damaskinos. Before Blade 2, Varela had appeared in several international productions and had gained significant attention playing the title role in the television production Cleopatra. Nyssa required a different presence from the more openly aggressive Blood Pack members. Varela gives her dignity and restraint, gradually allowing compassion and uncertainty to emerge beneath her loyalty to the vampire hierarchy. Her chemistry with Snipes introduces an unusual relationship between two people who should naturally be enemies. Norman Reedus appears as Scud, the young technician and weapons specialist working alongside Blade. Reedus was still years away from achieving worldwide fame as Daryl Dixon in The Walking Dead. Before Blade 2, he had appeared in films including Mimic, 6 Ways to Sunday, and The Boondock Saints. Scud allowed Reedus to display the relaxed, rebellious personality that would become familiar in later roles. Surrounded by serious warriors and ancient vampires, he provides a deliberately casual energy, treating extraordinary technology and supernatural warfare with the attitude of a mechanic working in his garage. Luke Goss delivers one of the film's most important performances as Jared Nomak, the first of the Reapers. Goss had originally achieved fame as a musician with the group Brothers before moving increasingly into acting. Nomak represented a dramatic opportunity to reinvent his screen image. Rather than playing the villain as a simple monster, Goss gives him physical intensity mixed with anger, suffering, and a strange sense of tragedy. His pale appearance, controlled movements, and emotional bitterness make Nomak feel like both predator and victim. When Blade 2 arrived in 2002, superhero cinema was still searching for the identity that would define it in the decades ahead. The first Blade had already demonstrated that a comic book property could succeed without being colorful, family-friendly, or closely associated with traditional superheroes. Blade 2 pushed that idea further. It presented its comic book world through horror imagery, martial arts, electronic music, industrial environments, and graphic violence. The result helped demonstrate that superhero films did not have to follow a single formula. They could borrow heavily from other genres while still remaining recognizable comic book adaptations. This is particularly significant when considering the period in which the movie appeared. X-Men had been released in 2000, Spider-Man arrived only weeks after Blade 2 in 2002, and the enormous superhero boom of later years had not yet begun. Blade existed outside the popular perception of characters such as Superman or Batman. Many viewers who watched the movies were not even aware that Blade originated in Marvel Comics. That allowed the series to develop a cinematic identity largely independent from expectations surrounding Marvel. Blade 2 therefore became an example of how relatively obscure comic characters could be transformed into successful movie properties. Wesley Snipes' portrayal also carried cultural importance. Blade was a black superhero leading a major theatrical action franchise years before interconnected superhero universes became dominant. The films did not constantly draw attention to this fact. Blade was simply presented as the central hero, the most dangerous warrior in the room, and someone both humans and vampires feared. His confidence, physical ability, clothing, weapons, and controlled attitude made him an unusually powerful screen presence. For audiences who rarely saw black characters positioned at the center of large-scale comic book action movies, Blade represented something significant. Blade 2 also strengthened the character's influence on the visual language of early 21st century action cinema. Blade's long black coat, sunglasses, body armor, sword, customized firearms, and martial arts movements formed a recognizable image that blended comic book design with contemporary action fashion. Some of these elements had already appeared in the original Blade and in films such as The Matrix, but the sequel pushed the aesthetic further into a world of underground clubs, industrial architecture, advanced weapons, and supernatural warriors. The combination became closely associated with the darker side of early 2000s genre cinema. The Reapers were another major contribution to popular horror imagery. Instead of simply giving Blade another group of conventional vampires to fight, the film introduced predators that threatened humans and vampires alike. Their most memorable characteristic was the jaw that separated into multiple sections, revealing a disturbing feeding structure underneath. The image became one of the defining visuals of Blade 2. It also reflected director Guillermo del Toro's fascination with unusual biological structures and monsters that are both horrifying and strangely beautiful. The design gained additional significance because similar ideas would later appear throughout del Toro's career. His creatures often possess elaborate anatomy rather than simply looking like altered humans. Audiences familiar with his later films can look back at Blade 2 and recognize ideas that would continue developing in Hellboy, Pan's Labyrinth, Hellboy 2, and other projects. In that sense, Blade 2 became an important bridge between a commercial Hollywood superhero sequel and the highly personal monster cinema that would make del Toro internationally celebrated. The film also contributed to the growing connection between martial arts and Western action movies. By 2002, audiences had become increasingly familiar with Hong Kong-inspired choreography, Particularly after The Matrix and the international success of performers such as Jackie Chan and Jet Li, Blade 2 embraced this trend while integrating it directly into a supernatural setting. Wesley Snipes already possessed genuine martial arts experience, and Donnie Yen participated both as an actor and in the action choreography. The result was a superhero whose combat identity depended as much on speed, kicks, swordsmanship, and hand-to-hand technique as on conventional weapons. This helped distinguish Blade from many earlier comic book heroes. His abilities were not represented only through visual effects. Much of his appeal came from watching a performer physically execute movements. That emphasis anticipated the importance of sophisticated fight choreography in later superhero and action productions. Modern audiences are accustomed to comic book characters participating in carefully designed close-quarters combat, but Blade 2 appeared during a period when this approach was still developing into a mainstream expectation. Its combination of horror and action also influenced the atmosphere surrounding vampire entertainment. Blade 2 arrived before the enormous vampire revival associated with later franchises and television series. Its vampires were not primarily romantic figures. They existed within a secret civilization governed by bloodlines, political authority, technology, nightclubs, and violent internal rivalries. The movie treated vampirism almost as an alternative society, with its own aristocracy and military forces. At the same time, the film inverted the traditional vampire hierarchy by creating the Reapers. Suddenly, creatures accustomed to treating humans as prey discovered that they could become prey themselves. This concept gave the movie a biological and evolutionary dimension that distinguished it from conventional supernatural stories. The vampire was no longer the final stage of the food chain. Something faster, hungrier, and more infectious had appeared. Blade 2 also became a cult favorite among viewers who preferred darker comic book adaptations. Its R-rated violence, grotesque creatures, aggressive soundtrack, and horror atmosphere gave it qualities that became less common once expensive superhero films increasingly targeted the broadest possible audience. For many fans, the movie represents a period when comic book adaptations could feel rougher, stranger, and less standardized. Its reputation has benefited from that contrast. The production of Blade 2 began with an important change behind the camera. Stephen Norrington, director of the original Blade, did not return, and Guillermo del Toro was chosen to direct the sequel. At the time, del Toro was already respected for films such as Cronos and The Devil's Backbone, but he had not yet achieved the worldwide recognition that would come later. Blade 2 gave him the opportunity to work on a larger Hollywood production while bringing his fascination with monsters, anatomy, machinery, insects, and gothic imagery into an established action franchise. Del Toro did not approach the project as a conventional vampire movie. One of his major goals was to create a new threat that could genuinely frighten vampires themselves. That idea became the Reapers. Instead of relying on traditional fangs, the creatures were designed with a disturbing mouth that opened into separate sections. The concept gave the Reapers an immediately recognizable silhouette and made feeding scenes considerably more grotesque. Their appearance reflected del Toro's preference for monsters whose biology appears to have an internal logic. The Reapers were not simply supernatural villains. They seemed like organisms designed to hunt and spread. Luke Goss, who played Nomak, had to endure an extensive physical transformation to become the central Reaper. Makeup effects changed his skin tone, facial structure, and overall appearance, while the elaborate mouth effect required a mixture of practical work and digital enhancement. Gus also trained heavily for the physical demands of the role. Nomak needed to move differently from ordinary vampires, appearing faster and more animalistic while still retaining enough humanity for the audience to recognize his intelligence and suffering. Wesley Snipes was deeply involved in the production beyond simply playing Blade. As a producer and experienced martial artist, he had a strong understanding of how the character should move and fight. Blade's action scenes therefore combined traditional stunt work, martial arts choreography, wire-assisted movement, and visual effects. The production also brought Donnie Yen into the project. Yen played Snowman, one of the Blood Pack members, but his greater contribution came through his involvement with action choreography. His experience in Hong Kong cinema helped reinforce the speed and martial arts influence of the combat sequences. The fight between Blade and Nomak became particularly important because the filmmakers needed to convince audiences that Blade had finally encountered an opponent capable of matching him physically. Earlier scenes established Blade as almost effortlessly superior to ordinary vampires. Nomak changes that balance. Their confrontations use rapid movement, heavy impacts, acrobatics, and environmental destruction to communicate that these are two extraordinary predators rather than ordinary men fighting. One of the more controversial production techniques involved digital doubles. Computer-generated versions of characters were occasionally used during movements considered too dangerous or physically impossible for performers. This technology was still developing rapidly in the early 2000s, and some shots appear noticeably artificial to modern viewers. The Blade vs. Blood Pack confrontation is one of the clearest examples. Characters suddenly perform extremely fast, exaggerated movements that transition between live-action performers and digital figures. Although the effect has aged, it represented an ambitious attempt to expand what superhero bodies could do on screen. Much of Blade 2 was filmed in Prague and surrounding locations in the Czech Republic. The European architecture provided the production with environments that could feel ancient and industrial at the same time. Rather than presenting the vampire world through familiar Gothic castles alone, the film combines old stone structures with laboratories, tunnels, warehouses, sewers, clubs, and advanced technology. This mixture became central to the movie's identity. The vampires are ancient creatures, but their civilization has adapted to the modern world. Production designer Carol Spire played an important role in creating this environment. Her previous collaborations with filmmakers including David Cronenberg made her particularly suited to a movie where technology and biology constantly overlap. Vampire headquarters, Blade's equipment, laboratory spaces, and the Reaper environments all needed to belong to the same universe while remaining visually distinct. The result is a world filled with metallic surfaces, medical equipment, industrial machinery, pipes, weapons, and organic horror. The House of Pain nightclub sequence became one of the film's largest and most memorable set pieces. Blade and the Blood Pack enter a crowded vampire club while searching for Reapers, only to discover that the predators have already infiltrated the location. The sequence required large numbers of extras, extensive lighting, stunt coordination, creature makeup, and carefully controlled action. Del Toro uses the crowded environment to create confusion. The characters cannot immediately distinguish ordinary vampires from infected threats, allowing the scene to shift from investigation to chaos. Practical creature effects remained extremely important throughout production. Makeup and prosthetic work provided the actors with physical creatures and injuries to react to, while computer-generated imagery expanded transformations and movements that practical effects could not accomplish alone. The film therefore occupies an interesting transitional period in visual effects history. Hollywood was increasingly embracing digital technology, but elaborate prosthetics and physical effects were still fundamental to major horror productions. The Reaper autopsy scene demonstrates Del Toro's enthusiasm for this combination. Rather than treating the monster merely as something to shoot, the film pauses to examine its anatomy. Whistler and the others discover biological adaptations that explain how the creature feeds and why it is difficult to kill. This scene turns monster design into storytelling. Every strange feature has a purpose, and understanding the creature becomes essential to surviving it. Blade 2 begins by immediately introducing the threat that will reshape the existing vampire world. In Prague, a weakened man named Jared Nomak enters a blood bank apparently seeking help. The employees initially appear sympathetic, but the facility is actually controlled by vampires who harvest vulnerable humans. Their confidence disappears when Nomak reveals what he really is. He is a Reaper, a mutated form of vampire with enormous strength, an overwhelming hunger for blood, and a mouth capable of opening into a terrifying feeding structure. By beginning with Nomak instead of Blade, the film establishes that the established predators are about to become prey. The story then returns to Blade, who has spent 2 years searching for his mentor, Abraham Whistler. Blade believes Whistler survived the events of the first movie and has been transformed into a vampire. Working with his new technician, Scud, Blade attacks vampire locations until he finally discovers Whistler imprisoned inside a tank. Rather than immediately killing him, Blade brings him home and attempts to reverse his condition. This opening section re-established Blade as a relentless hunter while restoring the emotional relationship at the center of the series. The first major turning point occurs when Blade's headquarters is infiltrated by highly trained vampires. Blade initially assumes they have come to kill him, but the confrontation reveals something unexpected. They represent vampire ruler Eli Damaskinos, who wants Blade's help. Blade is brought before Damaskinos and his daughter Nissa, where he learns about the Reapers. These creatures feed on both humans and vampires, and their bite spreads the mutation. If the infection continues unchecked, both populations could eventually be threatened. This creates the central narrative device of Blade 2. Enemies must temporarily cooperate against a greater enemy. Blade is assigned to work with the Blood Pack, an elite vampire combat team originally trained to hunt and kill him. The group includes Reinhard, Chupa, Snowman, Verlaine, Lighthammer, Priest, and Assad. Their presence immediately creates tension because the alliance exists only out of necessity. Blade knows they despise him, and the Blood Pack resent being commanded by the person they were created to destroy. The House of Pain sequence marks the transition into the movie's central conflict. Blade and the Blood Pack enter a crowded vampire nightclub searching for Reapers. The mission quickly collapses when the creatures attack from within the crowd. Priest is bitten, several fighters become separated, and the team discovers that ordinary weapons are surprisingly ineffective. The Reapers can survive injuries that would destroy normal vampires. Blade eventually realizes that ultraviolet light remains one of their major vulnerabilities. This sequence also changes the team's understanding of the enemy. Until this point, the Reapers have been treated as dangerous but potentially manageable targets. After the nightclub attack, it becomes clear that they represent an infection capable of spreading with terrifying speed. Priest begins transforming after being bitten, forcing the group to witness what the Reaper virus does to a vampire. The threat is therefore not only death. Every casualty can become another enemy. The middle portion of Blade 2 slows briefly to allow investigation and character conflict. The body of a Reaper is examined, revealing that its anatomy has changed to support constant feeding. Nissa and Blade begin developing mutual respect, while Whistler becomes increasingly suspicious of Scud. At the same time, Nomak is given enough attention to establish that he is not a mindless creature. He appears to understand the vampire system and carries a personal hatred toward Damaskinos. The next major mission takes the group into the sewers, where the Reapers are believed to be hiding. Structurally, this section resembles a survival horror story. The team divides into smaller units. Visibility is limited, communication becomes difficult, and characters are eliminated one by one. Chupa turns against Whistler, showing that the alliance is beginning to collapse even before the Reapers finish attacking. Lighthammer hides the fact that he has been infected, eventually transforming and forcing Verlaine to make a fatal choice. Blade's plan involves using ultraviolet lights as a large-scale weapon. When the system activates, the Reapers are devastated, but Nomak survives long enough to continue the larger conflict. The sequence initially appears to represent victory, yet the narrative immediately reveals that Blade and his allies have misunderstood the true nature of the situation. The central plot twist comes when Damaskinos forces capture Blade. The Reapers were not simply a natural mutation. Nomak is connected directly to Damaskinos and was created through vampire experimentation intended to produce a superior species. Instead of creating perfection, the experiments produced a creature whose hunger threatens the entire vampire population. Nomak is also revealed to be Damaskinos' son, transforming the conflict from a simple monster outbreak into a twisted family tragedy. Scud's betrayal forms another major reversal. He reveals that he has secretly been working for Damaskinos. The apparent young outsider who seemed loyal to Blade has actually been helping the vampires manipulate him. However, Blade has already discovered the deception. The explosive device Scud believed to be harmless is genuine, and Blade detonates it, killing him. The moment reinforces Blade's intelligence. He has not survived through physical power alone. He constantly assumes that those around him may betray him. After being captured and drained of blood, Blade appears physically defeated. His recovery provides the film with its traditional heroic resurgence. Once he regains his strength, the story shifts from horror survival back toward aggressive action. Blade tears through Damasceno's security forces and confronts Reinhardt, finally settling the hostility that has existed between them since their first meeting. Meanwhile, Nomak enters the vampire stronghold seeking revenge. His objective is no longer mysterious. Beneath its action, vampire mythology, and graphic horror, Blade 2 explores a surprisingly rich collection of themes. The most important is the idea of evolution becoming self-destruction. Throughout the movie, vampires consider themselves superior to human beings. They are stronger, faster, longer-lived, and organized within an ancient social hierarchy. Eli Damasceno takes this belief to its logical extreme. Rather than accepting the limitations of his species, he attempts to engineer something better. His experiments produce Nomak and the Reapers, creatures that threaten to replace the very species they were designed to improve. This gives the Reapers symbolic importance beyond their role as monsters. They represent uncontrolled ambition. Damasceno wants perfection, but his definition of perfection is based almost entirely on power and survival. The result possesses greater physical abilities but also an uncontrollable hunger. The supposedly superior organism becomes incapable of existing without consuming everything around it. Evolution without restraint therefore becomes degeneration. The vampires attempt to move upward in the food chain and accidentally create something that places them below it. Nomak embodies this theme personally. At first he appears to be the film's primary villain, but the story gradually reveals him as both an antagonist and a victim. He did not choose his condition. His father created him through experimentation and then rejected the result. His violence is horrifying, yet it grows from betrayal, pain, and a desire for revenge. The monster is ultimately the abandoned child of the society that fears him. Family is consequently another important theme. Blade 2 presents several distorted versions of family relationships. Blade and Whistler are not biologically related, but their connection is arguably the healthiest family bond in the movie. Blade spends years searching for Whistler after refusing to believe he is truly gone. When he finds him transformed into a vampire, he chooses treatment rather than immediate execution. For a character who normally kills vampires without hesitation, this decision reveals the depth of his attachment. Damasceno and his children provide the opposite example. His relationship with Nomak is based on experimentation, rejection, and shame, while his relationship with Nyssa depends upon obedience and manipulation. Damasceno speaks about the survival of his people, yet he is willing to sacrifice members of his own family to achieve his ambitions. Blade, supposedly the emotionally distant outsider, displays greater loyalty than the aristocratic vampire patriarch who constantly speaks about blood and lineage. Blood itself functions as the film's most obvious recurring symbol. In vampire mythology, blood traditionally represents life, death, desire, inheritance, and corruption. Blade 2 uses all of these meanings. Blood is food for vampires, but it is also a biological connection between characters. Nomak and Nyssa share the blood of Damasceno, while Blade exists between human and vampire biology. The Reaper infection spreads through feeding, turning blood from a source of life into a mechanism of contamination. Blade's relationship with blood is especially complicated. He requires serum to suppress his vampire hunger, meaning his identity depends on controlling something inside himself that constantly threatens to emerge. During the climax, when Blade has been weakened after his blood is harvested, blood becomes the source of his physical restoration. The imagery reminds the audience that Blade's greatest strength and greatest danger come from the same place. Identity is therefore another central theme. Blade belongs fully to neither humanity nor vampire society. He possesses vampire abilities without accepting vampire values, making him an outsider to both worlds. Nyssa initially views the distinction between vampires and humans through the assumptions of her upbringing, but her experiences with Blade gradually complicate those beliefs. Nomak exists in an even more isolated position. He is rejected by vampires while becoming a threat to humans and Reapers alike. These characters represent different responses to identities they did not entirely choose. Blade controls his nature through discipline. Nyssa questions the ideology she inherited. Nomak turns his suffering outward and seeks revenge against those responsible for creating him. Their different paths suggest that biology may establish certain conditions, but it does not completely determine moral identity. The Reapers also symbolize disease and fear of infection. Their bite spreads rapidly, and infected vampires transform into creatures driven by uncontrollable hunger. The Bloodpack's missions therefore resemble attempts to contain an epidemic. Characters examine bodies, discuss transmission, hide infections, and attempt to prevent further spread. Lighthammer concealing his wound is particularly significant because personal fear places everyone around him at risk. Light and darkness carry equally important symbolic meaning. Most of Blade 2 takes place at night, underground, or inside sealed structures. Vampires build their civilization around avoiding sunlight, creating a world of artificial illumination. Ultraviolet technology turns light itself into a weapon. Something associated with clarity, safety, and life becomes violently destructive to creatures of darkness. Nyssa's final scene develops this symbolism emotionally. After being infected, she chooses to experience the sunrise rather than continue transforming. Throughout the movie, daylight represents death for vampires, but for Nyssa it becomes liberation. She wants to see something forbidden to her species, even knowing it will destroy her. Her death transforms sunlight from a weapon into something peaceful and almost spiritual. The movie also repeatedly examines predator and prey relationships. Vampires view humans as livestock. Blade hunts vampires. The Reapers hunt both. Every level of superiority is eventually challenged by something stronger. This creates a constantly shifting food chain. The vampire's terror when facing Reapers is significant because they suddenly experience the vulnerability they routinely impose upon humans. Blade stands apart from this cycle because he possesses predatory power but deliberately restricts it. His discipline becomes a moral quality. Strength alone does not distinguish the hero from the monsters. Blade 2 has one of the most distinctive visual identities of any comic book movie from the early 2000s. Director Guillermo del Toro and cinematographer Gabriel Beristain created a world built from darkness, metallic surfaces, saturated artificial light, Gothic architecture, and industrial decay. The film retains the black leather and urban attitude established by the original Blade, but pushes the imagery much further toward horror. Almost every environment suggests that another world exists beneath ordinary human society, hidden inside warehouses, tunnels, laboratories, nightclubs, and ancient buildings. Darkness dominates the cinematography for practical and thematic reasons. Vampires cannot survive sunlight, so their civilization naturally exists at night or inside protected spaces. Instead of allowing these restrictions to make every scene visually similar, the filmmakers used different kinds of artificial illumination to separate locations. Cold blue and green tones frequently dominate laboratories and underground environments, while warmer yellows and reds appear around blood, fire, and more threatening spaces. The constantly changing light gives the darkness texture rather than simply making the image difficult to see. Blade himself is photographed as a visual icon. His black clothing, sunglasses, body armor, and long coat create a silhouette that remains recognizable even when much of the frame is shadowed. The reflective surfaces of his glasses frequently conceal his eyes, reinforcing his emotional distance. Blade rarely appears vulnerable through his posture. He stands upright, moves deliberately, and is often framed in ways that emphasize his control of the environment. When the film finally weakens him physically, the contrast is immediately noticeable because the audience has become accustomed to seeing him dominate the frame. The camera becomes much more energetic during combat. Blade 2 uses rapid editing, low angles, tracking movements, close shots of impacts, and wider compositions that allow martial arts choreography to remain visible. The approach reflects the growing influence of Hong Kong action cinema on Western filmmaking. Wesley Snipes' physical ability allows the filmmakers to show complete movements rather than depending entirely on editing to create the illusion of fighting. At certain moments, however, the movie deliberately moves beyond what a human performer could realistically accomplish. Digital doubles are used for extremely fast jumps, spins, and impacts. The confrontation between Blade and members of the Blood Pack inside his headquarters is the most obvious example. Bodies suddenly move with exaggerated speed and flexibility as the film transitions between live performers and computer-generated figures. These shots have aged more noticeably than the practical photography, but they reveal an important moment in visual effects history when filmmakers were experimenting with digital characters as extensions of live-action performers. The Reapers demonstrate the film's more successful combination of practical and digital effects. Their basic appearance is created through makeup, prosthetics, costumes, and performance, giving them physical weight when interacting with actors. Digital effects then expand the mouth and enhance movements that would be impossible to achieve mechanically. The splitting jaw is particularly effective because the transformation begins with a recognizable human face before destroying its familiar structure. Del Toro understands that revealing a monster too clearly can reduce its impact, so the Reapers are initially presented through fragments. Audiences see pale skin, unusual movement, sudden attacks, and glimpses of the mouth before receiving a complete understanding of their anatomy. The opening blood bank sequence establishes this approach immediately. Nomak initially resembles a sick human being, allowing the transformation into Predator to become far more disturbing. The House of Pain sequence represents the film's visual style at its most chaotic. The nightclub is filled with moving bodies, flashing lights, deep shadows, music, smoke, and intense color. Blade and the Blood Pack enter an environment already difficult to visually interpret, and the Reapers exploit that confusion. The cinematography prevents the audience from feeling completely secure about where the next attack will originate. The location becomes both an action arena and a horror maze. By contrast, Damaskino's headquarters uses controlled compositions and monumental spaces to communicate authority. The vampire ruler surrounds himself with architecture, technology, and servants that suggest enormous resources. His world combines aristocratic imagery with modern scientific equipment. This visual contradiction reflects vampire society itself. These are ancient beings who have survived by embracing modern technology without abandoning ideas of bloodline and hierarchy. The source sequences shift the film towards survival horror. Narrow passages, wet surfaces, darkness, flashlights, and limited visibility create a claustrophobic atmosphere. Characters are divided into smaller groups, allowing the composition to isolate them within the frame. The Reapers can emerge from ceilings, water, tunnels, or darkness, meaning empty space becomes threatening. The audience begins searching the background for movement before the characters notice danger. Ultraviolet light becomes one of the movie's strongest visual motifs. Because UV radiation is lethal to vampires and Reapers, light can function almost like ammunition. The ultraviolet weapons produce an unnatural brightness that cuts through the film's dominant darkness. During the sewer operation, the large-scale UV system transforms illumination itself into a spectacular instrument of destruction. This reversal is visually appropriate for a story in which the normal predator and prey relationship has also been reversed. The film frequently uses architecture to emphasize vertical and spatial relationships. Characters appear on balconies, platforms, tunnels, staircases, and elevated industrial structures. Blade often enters scenes from visually commanding positions before moving rapidly into combat. Nomak, meanwhile, is frequently associated with hidden or lower spaces, emphasizing his existence outside established vampire society. The sound of Blade 2 is as aggressive and distinctive as its visual style. Music, mechanical noise, creature sounds, gunfire, martial arts impacts, and moments of near silence combine to create a world that feels dangerous even before violence begins. Rather than treating audio as background decoration, the film uses it to reinforce the collision of genres at the center of the story. Blade 2 is simultaneously a superhero film, vampire horror story, martial arts movie, and early 2000s action spectacle, and its soundtrack reflects all of those identities. Marco Beltrami composed the original score, bringing orchestral suspense and horror elements to the film. Beltrami was already strongly associated with genre cinema through his work on movies such as Scream, Mimic, and The Faculty. His experience with horror was particularly valuable because Blade 2 required music that could make the Reapers frightening while still supporting large-scale action. The score frequently uses threatening rhythms, dark orchestral textures, percussion, and sudden musical changes to keep the audience uncomfortable. Blade scenes require a different energy from those centered on the Reapers. When Blade controls a confrontation, the music can become rhythmic and confident, supporting his almost unstoppable screen presence. When Nomak or the Reapers dominate, the sound becomes more threatening and unpredictable. This musical contrast helps establish the changing balance of power. Blade may normally be the hunter, but the soundtrack tells the audience when he has entered an environment where he no longer possesses complete control. The film is also strongly associated with its commercially released soundtrack, which brought together hip-hop and electronic artists. This approach was perfectly suited to Blade's cinematic identity. The original movie had already connected the character with nightclub culture and electronic music, and Blade 2 expanded that connection. The soundtrack included collaborations involving artists such as Ice Cube, Paul Oakenfold, Busta Rhymes, The Crystal Method, Cypress Hill, Ronnie Size, Mos Def, Massive Attack, Mystical, Moby, and others. Rather than simply assembling unrelated popular songs, the soundtrack was promoted around collaborations between hip-hop performers and electronic producers. That concept reflected the movie itself. Blade exists between categories: human and vampire, superhero and monster hunter, martial artist and heavily armed action hero. The music similarly crosses boundaries, combining rap vocals with electronic production, breakbeats, industrial textures, and club rhythms. One of the soundtrack's most recognizable pieces is Blade, performed through the collaboration between Ice Cube and Paul Oakenfold. The track captures the character's aggressive confidence while connecting the movie to the electronic sound that had become strongly associated with stylish action cinema around the turn of the millennium. Other collaborations extend the idea, giving the soundtrack the feeling of a deliberate musical project rather than a conventional collection of songs attached to a blockbuster. Club music is particularly important because nightlife is part of the Blade universe. Vampires do not simply hide in castles. They occupy secret clubs and underground social spaces where music, darkness, crowds, and predatory behavior coexist. The House of Pain sequence uses this environment effectively. Loud music initially represents vampire confidence and pleasure, but once the Reapers attack, the same crowded sensory environment becomes confusing and dangerous. The sound design of the Reapers is equally important to their effectiveness. Their appearance is disturbing, but the noises associated with their bodies make them feel even less human. Feeding, breathing, movement, impacts, and the opening of their unusual jaws all contribute to the impression that their anatomy functions differently from that of ordinary vampires. Wet and organic sounds emphasize the biological horror of the transformation. Nomak's soundscape is often more restrained than the chaos surrounding ordinary Reaper attacks. Because he remains intelligent, the filmmakers allow him moments of stillness. His breathing, footsteps, and voice remind the audience that a person still exists within the creature. Luke Goss' controlled vocal performance is therefore part of the sound design. Nomak does not need to scream constantly to appear dangerous. His quieter delivery can make him more threatening because it suggests awareness and purpose. Weapons have their own strong sonic identity. Blade's firearms are given heavy reports, while his sword produces sharp metallic movements that help communicate speed. Stakes, blades, punches, kicks, breaking bones, shattered surfaces, and body-striking walls are exaggerated enough to give combat a heightened comic book quality. The fights are not designed to sound completely realistic. They are designed to make Blade's strength and precision physically satisfying. This is particularly noticeable in hand-to-hand combat. A punch needs to communicate more than contact between two bodies when the characters possess supernatural strength. Impacts therefore carry substantial weight. Combined with rapid editing and martial arts choreography, these sounds make individual movements easier to follow. Even when the image becomes extremely fast, the audio helps define kicks, blocks, falls, weapon strikes, and environmental destruction. Mechanical sounds also contribute to the film's atmosphere. Blade's headquarters contains weapons, computers, vehicles, and specialized equipment. Vampire laboratories contain medical machinery and experimental technology. These noises reinforce the idea that this is not a traditional Gothic vampire world. Blade 2 arrived in theaters in March 2002, carrying considerably greater expectations than its predecessor. The original Blade had demonstrated that a relatively obscure Marvel character could support a successful R-rated action movie, and the sequel now had to prove that the concept could grow into a genuine franchise. The response was generally positive among audiences and more divided among professional critics, but the film succeeded where it mattered commercially. It expanded the scale of the series, earned more money than the first installment, and helped establish Blade as one of the important comic book movie franchises of the period. The commercial performance was particularly significant. Produced for a budget commonly reported at around $50 million, Blade 2 earned more than $150 million worldwide. That represented an improvement over the worldwide theatrical performance of the first Blade. For an R-rated superhero horror film released before comic book movies became Hollywood's dominant form of blockbuster entertainment, those numbers demonstrated considerable audience interest. Its opening was also strong enough to confirm that Blade had become a recognizable theatrical character. Wesley Snipes was no longer simply an action star playing a comic book hero. For many moviegoers, he was Blade. The black coat, sunglasses, sword, martial arts techniques, and controlled personality had become an established screen identity, and the sequel benefited from that familiarity. Critical reaction was more complicated. Reviewers commonly praised the movie's energy, creature design, action sequences, and Guillermo del Toro's visual imagination. Even critics who were less enthusiastic about the story frequently acknowledged the director's ability to create atmosphere. The Reapers received particular attention because they provided something visually different from conventional cinematic vampires. Their pale bodies, predatory behavior, and splitting jaws pushed the movie firmly into body horror. The film's action was another frequent source of praise. Wesley Snipes' martial arts ability gave Blade a physical credibility that distinguished him from many contemporary comic book heroes. The Blood Pack also allowed the sequel to increase the number and variety of combatants. Instead of watching Blade fight anonymous vampires throughout the entire movie, audiences were introduced to a team of specialized warriors who could challenge him, cooperate with him, and eventually become victims of the Reaper outbreak. Some critics, however, felt that spectacle received more attention than characterization. The Blood Pack contains numerous visually distinctive members, but several receive limited development before being killed. Viewers who expected the team to function as a large ensemble could therefore find individual characters underused. Donnie Yen Snowman is a notable example. His martial arts reputation makes his presence exciting, but the character has relatively little dialogue or narrative development. The screenplay also attracted criticism for relying on familiar genre structures. The uneasy alliance between enemies, the specialized team entering hostile territory, the hidden betrayal, and the scientific experiment that escapes control all had precedence in horror and science fiction. Some reviews saw the film as a collection of recognizable ideas presented with exceptional style, rather than an especially original narrative. For supporters, however, this combination was precisely part of its appeal. Blade 2 does not hide its influences. It mixes vampire mythology with elements of monster movies, military team adventures, martial arts cinema, body horror, and survival stories. Del Toro's direction gives these familiar components enough personality to prevent the movie from feeling like a routine superhero sequel. The digital effects produced a more divided reaction and have become one of the most discussed aspects of the film in later retrospectives. During several fights, digital doubles allow characters to perform movements that would have been extremely difficult or dangerous using conventional stunt techniques. In 2002, this represented ambitious experimentation. Viewed decades later, some transitions between real performers and computer-generated bodies are obvious. The Blade versus Bloodpack confrontation is frequently mentioned in this context. The movement suddenly becomes unusually fluid and exaggerated, revealing the limitations of early digital human animation. Yet the sequence also demonstrates the filmmaker's desire to present comic book bodies as capable of movements beyond ordinary physical restrictions. The technology may have aged, but the creative ambition behind it remains visible. Practical effects have generally aged much better. The Reaper makeup, prosthetics, blood effects, physical environments, and mechanical details give the film a tactile quality that continues to appeal to horror audiences. The combination of practical work with digital enhancement is one reason the creatures remain memorable. More than 2 decades after its release, Blade 2 occupies an important position in the development of modern comic book cinema. It appeared before superhero films became the dominant form of blockbuster entertainment, and before audiences expected every comic adaptation to connect with a larger cinematic universe. Because of that freedom, Blade 2 developed an identity that feels unusually independent. It is a Marvel adaptation, but it is equally a horror film, martial arts movie, creature feature, and violent action thriller. That mixture became one of the central reasons for its lasting reputation. One of its greatest contributions was demonstrating that superhero cinema could successfully embrace horror. Blade had already established this possibility in 1998, but the sequel pushed much further into disturbing creature design and body horror. The Reapers are not merely stronger vampires. Their transformed bodies, splitting jaws, compulsive feeding, and infectious nature make them genuine horror monsters. Blade 2 showed that a comic book adaptation could retain the scale and excitement of an action blockbuster without abandoning frightening imagery. This approach became increasingly relevant as later filmmakers experimented with genre combinations inside superhero stories. Modern comic adaptations have incorporated political thrillers, science fiction, comedy, fantasy, crime drama, and horror. Blade 2 belongs to an earlier generation that demonstrated how effectively those boundaries could be crossed. It does not interrupt its horror elements because it is afraid of becoming too frightening. Instead, horror is fundamental to the movie's personality. The film also contributed to the growing importance of sophisticated martial arts choreography in Western comic book cinema. Blade's fighting style had already distinguished the first film, but Blade 2 expanded the scale and speed of the combat. Wesley Snipes' genuine martial arts experience allowed Blade to appear convincing in close combat, while Donnie Yen's involvement with the action team strengthened the Hong Kong influence. Sword fighting, kicks, acrobatics, firearms, and supernatural abilities could all exist within the same sequence. This helped reinforce the idea that a superhero's fighting style could be part of characterization. Blade does not simply possess superhuman strength. He has discipline, technique, preferred weapons, recognizable movements, and a particular rhythm in combat. Later action franchises would increasingly emphasize individualized fighting styles, especially when adapting characters known for martial arts or close-quarters combat. Blade 2 is also significant within Guillermo del Toro's career. Although he had already directed acclaimed work, this was one of his major opportunities to operate inside a large commercial franchise. Instead of suppressing his interests, he filled the movie with them. Biological abnormalities, elaborate monsters, machinery, underground environments, sympathetic outsiders, and morally corrupt authority figures all became essential parts of the film. Several ideas visible here would become even more recognizable in Del Toro's later work. His monsters are frequently more emotionally complicated than the humans or institutions opposing them. Nomak is an excellent early example. He enters the story as a terrifying predator, but gradually becomes a tragic consequence of someone else's ambition. The elegant Damascenos ultimately carries greater moral responsibility than the deformed creature he created. Del Toro's successful handling of Blade 2 also helped demonstrate that he could combine personal visual interest with the demands of a commercial action production. He soon moved on to Hellboy, another comic book adaptation that allowed him even greater creative freedom. Ron Perlman followed him from Blade 2 into that project, while Luke Goss later reunited with the director in Hellboy 2, The Golden Army. Looking across these films, Blade 2 feels like an important transitional chapter in the development of Del Toro's Hollywood career. The Reaper design has created a legacy of its own. Their opening jaws remain one of the most immediately recognizable monster images from early 2000s horror. The design is effective because it transforms a familiar human feature into something biologically impossible. Instead of merely extending traditional vampire fangs, the entire lower face becomes a feeding mechanism. The concept helped distinguish the Reapers from decades of cinematic vampires. The film's influence can also be felt in the continued popularity of stories where monsters encounter something even more dangerous than themselves. Blade 2 reverses the established food chain. Vampires begin as humanity's hidden predators, but the Reapers force them to experience fear from the position of prey. This predator versus super-predator structure has remained a powerful device in action horror because it immediately changes the audience's relationship with familiar monsters. Wesley Snipes' Blade has also grown in historical importance. When the films were originally released, Blade could sometimes be treated as separate from the larger history of superhero cinema because many casual viewers did not strongly associate him with Marvel. In retrospect, his achievements are impossible to ignore. Snipes successfully led an R-rated Marvel film franchise years before the enormous expansion of Marvel-based cinema. His portrayal helped establish Blade as a mainstream character. For millions of viewers, the cinematic version became their primary understanding of the hero. The black tactical clothing, long coat, sunglasses, sword, firearms, controlled voice, and martial arts ability became so strongly associated with Blade that later interpretations inevitably invite comparison with Snipes. The film's success naturally continued the franchise. Blade: Trinity followed in 2004, again starring Snipes alongside Kristofferson, while introducing characters played by Ryan Reynolds and Jessica Biel. The third movie received a more divided response and did not achieve the same reputation as Blade 2. This ultimately strengthened the second film's standing, with many fans viewing it as the point where the original trilogy reached its creative peak. For audiences in 2002, Blade 2 arrived at a fascinating moment in popular cinema. Superhero movies were becoming increasingly important, but they had not yet developed the familiar structure that would dominate the following decades. Viewers could therefore encounter Blade 2 primarily as an action and horror experience rather than as one chapter in an enormous interconnected universe. For many people, the fact that Blade originated in Marvel Comics was secondary. Wesley Snipes was Blade, and audiences came to see him hunt vampires with swords, guns, martial arts, and an attitude unlike almost any other hero of the period. One of the strongest audience reactions came from the film's sense of confidence. Blade is not presented as someone learning how to become a hero. He already understands his abilities, his enemies, and his mission. Younger viewers accustomed to origin stories could find that especially exciting. The movie wastes little time explaining why Blade is dangerous. Instead, audiences watch other characters discover just how dangerous he is. His confrontation with the Blood Pack captures this perfectly. They were trained to kill him, yet Blade quickly demonstrates that their preparation has not made them his equals. For teenagers and young adults of the early 2000s, Blade's appearance also reflected contemporary ideas of cinematic cool. The sunglasses, black clothing, long coat, customized weapons, motorcycles, electronic music, and martial arts existed within the same cultural environment that had made movies such as The Matrix enormously influential. Blade 2 embraced that aesthetic without simply copying it. Blade's vampire mythology and Snipes' personality gave the style a different identity. Horror audiences often responded to the Reapers most strongly. Viewers familiar with traditional vampires expected fangs, blood, and supernatural strength. But Nomak's transformation introduced something far more disturbing. The opening of the Reaper jaw became the kind of image that could remain in someone's memory long after individual plot details faded. For younger viewers who encountered Blade 2 on television or home video, that reveal could be genuinely shocking. The Reapers also changed the emotional relationship between audiences and the vampires. Normally, the vampires would be the monsters everyone fears. Blade 2 forces viewers to watch those monsters become frightened themselves. There is a strange satisfaction in seeing arrogant predators suddenly confronted with something higher on the food chain. At the same time, the alliance creates temporary sympathy for characters Blade would normally kill without hesitation. Nyssa became particularly important in this regard. Through her relationship with Blade, audiences are encouraged to see that vampire society is not composed entirely of identical personalities. She begins as someone loyal to her father and her species, but gradually discovers the cruelty behind Damasceno's plans. Her respect for Blade grows because he repeatedly behaves with more integrity than the supposedly superior civilization she serves. Nomak produced an even more complicated reaction. Initially, audiences are encouraged to fear him. His physical appearance and feeding behavior place him firmly within monster territory. As the story develops, however, viewers learn that his condition resulted from experimentation and rejection. By the climax, it becomes possible to understand his hatred without approving of his actions. Some viewers may even regard Damasceno as the true villain. This interpretation reflects one of Guillermo del Toro's recurring strengths. He frequently encourages audiences to question which character actually deserves to be called a monster. Blade 2 gives the physically monstrous character an understandable grievance while placing enormous moral corruption inside an elegant and sophisticated leader. The contrast allows the movie to become more emotionally complicated than its surface-level story of vampire hunters fighting mutated creatures might suggest. Blade himself resonated differently with different audiences. For action fans, he represented an exceptionally capable warrior. For comic book fans, he demonstrated that lesser-known characters could become major cinematic heroes. For Black audiences, his position carried additional significance because successful Black-led superhero franchises were extremely rare. Blade's identity was not treated as a marketing gimmick inside the story. He was simply allowed to occupy the center of a large-scale action franchise. That representation became more historically noticeable with time. Younger generations growing up during the later superhero boom could look backward and discover that Wesley Snipes had already led a successful Marvel trilogy years before cinematic universes became mainstream. This has contributed to renewed appreciation for the Blade movies and for Snipes' role in establishing the viability of comic book cinema. Audiences have also interpreted Blade 2 through nostalgia. Viewers who first encountered it in theaters, on DVD, or through television broadcasts often associate it strongly with early 2000s entertainment. The soundtrack, editing, visual effects, fashion, and nightclub imagery immediately identify the era. Elements once considered contemporary now function almost like a cultural time capsule. The early digital effect produced particularly interesting modern reactions. Some viewers find the computer-generated doubles distracting because current visual effects can produce far more convincing human movement. Others enjoy their exaggerated quality because it contributes to the film's comic book atmosphere. The imperfections have become part of the experience rather than completely destroying it. Blade 2 is driven by characters who are forced to reconsider their identities, loyalties, and assumptions. Although Blade begins and ends the film as the confident vampire hunter audiences already know, his journey is not about learning how to fight or discovering new powers. Instead, his development is revealed through relationships. Whistler, Nyssa, Nomak, and the Blood Pack expose different sides of a hero who normally hides emotion beneath discipline, sarcasm, and violence. Blade begins the story with an act that immediately demonstrates his deepest loyalty. He has spent 2 years searching for Abraham Whistler, refusing to accept that his mentor is permanently lost. When he finally discovers Whistler alive but transformed into a vampire, Blade does something unusual. His normal philosophy would demand immediate execution, yet he gives Whistler an opportunity to recover. The decision reveals that Blade's emotional rules are more complicated than his professional ones. Whistler is family, even if Blade would never describe their relationship sentimentally. This relationship is important because Whistler represents Blade's connection to humanity. Blade exists between 2 species. He possesses vampire abilities and hunger, but chooses to defend humans. Whistler helped shape that choice. Their interactions contain arguments and sarcasm, but beneath them is enormous trust. Blade rescuing Whistler is therefore more than the return of a familiar supporting character. It establishes that beneath Blade's controlled exterior is someone capable of intense attachment. Whistler has his own smaller but meaningful arc. After surviving imprisonment and vampirism, he returns to discover that Scud has taken his place as Blade's weapon specialist. Whistler immediately distrusts the younger man. Some of this hostility appears territorial. He has returned from an experience that left him physically and psychologically damaged, only to find someone else working beside the person he considers almost a son. His suspicion eventually proved justified. Scud has secretly betrayed Blade to Damaskinos. Whistler's instincts demonstrate that age and experience still have value in a world increasingly filled with advanced technology and younger fighters. His survival during the Saw mission reinforces the same idea. He may lack Blade's supernatural abilities, but he understands how predators behave and knows that survival often depends on patience rather than strength. Nyssa experiences one of the film's clearest transformations. She begins as a loyal daughter of Damaskinos and a representative of vampire authority. Although she is less openly hostile than members of the Blood Pack, she still believes in the social order that places vampires above humans. Working with Blade gradually challenges this certainty. The supposed enemy repeatedly demonstrates courage, intelligence, loyalty, and restraint. Her growing respect for Blade is important because neither character completely abandons who they are. Blade does not suddenly trust vampire society, and Nyssa does not immediately reject her family. Their connection develops through shared danger. Each recognizes something in the other that contradicts established prejudice. Blade discovers a vampire capable of compassion, while Nyssa discovers that the Daywalker she was taught to view as an enemy possesses greater honor than many members of her own society. The revelation about Nomak destroys the remaining foundation of Nyssa's loyalty. She discovers that her father created the Reaper threat and that Nomak is her brother. The crisis she believed was an external attack on vampire civilization was actually produced by the ambitions of its leader. Her father's willingness to manipulate his own children makes continued loyalty impossible. Nyssa's final choice completes her arc. After being infected, she refuses to become a Reaper and asks Blade to take her outside to see the sunrise. For most vampires, sunlight represents terror and death. For Nyssa, it becomes freedom. She chooses her fate rather than allowing her father, her biology, or the infection to determine what she will become. Nomak follows a darker parallel journey. He initially appears to be a nearly unstoppable monster driven by hunger. Gradually, the audience discovers intelligence and purpose behind his attacks. Nomak is not randomly destroying vampires. His hatred is directed toward the civilization responsible for his creation and especially toward Damaskinos. This knowledge changes the meaning of his violence. Nomak remains dangerous and kills without mercy, but his anger has a recognizable origin. He is an experiment treated as a failure by his own father. His transformation has made him physically superior while leaving him emotionally defined by rejection. Unlike Blade, who also exists between biological categories, Nomak cannot transform alienation into discipline. He turns pain into revenge. Blade and Nomak therefore function as distorted reflections of one another. Both are hybrids who exist outside conventional vampire society. Both possess unusual physical advantages, and neither fully belongs to the world that produced him. Blade responds by constructing a purpose. Nomak responds by trying to destroy those he blames. Their final fight is consequently more than a contest between hero and villain. It places two responses to outsider identity against each other. Damaskinos undergoes little personal growth, but that lack of development is central to his role. He begins convinced that his intelligence and authority justify manipulating life, and he remains committed to that belief even when confronted by the consequences. He speaks about improving the vampire species while treating individuals, including his own children, as material for experimentation. Reinhardt also resists change. From his first encounter with Blade, he is consumed by hostility and wounded pride. Blade humiliates him by attaching an explosive device to the back of his head, and Reinhardt spends much of the film waiting for an opportunity to retaliate. Even the Reaper crisis cannot completely overcome his hatred. The costume and set design of Blade 2 are fundamental to the film's identity. Rather than presenting vampires through traditional capes, castles, and historical clothing, the movie imagines an underground civilization that is adapted to the modern world. Ancient bloodlines exist alongside laboratories, tactical equipment, motorcycles, electronic music, and advanced weapons. Every major character and location reflects this combination of Gothic mythology and early 2000s industrial culture, creating a world that feels both ancient and aggressively modern. Blade costume remains the most recognizable design in the film. Wesley Snipes was an almost entirely black combat outfit built around leather, body armor, boots, gloves, sunglasses, and his long coat. The clothing immediately separates Blade from ordinary people, while also distinguishing him from the aristocratic vampires. He does not dress ceremonially. Everything about his appearance suggests movement, protection, intimidation, and combat. Even when certain elements are primarily stylistic, they look as though they belong to someone who expects violence at any moment. His sunglasses are particularly important. They became one of Blade's defining visual trademarks, but they also serve a character function. By hiding his eyes, the glasses make his emotions difficult to read. Blade frequently enters confrontations without revealing fear, anger, or uncertainty. The audience must judge his intentions through his posture and voice. Removing direct access to his eyes makes him appear even more controlled. Blade's sword completes the silhouette, carried vertically across his back. It is both a weapon and a visual symbol. Guns connect Blade to contemporary action cinema, while the sword gives him the quality of an ancient warrior. This combination perfectly represents a character fighting an old supernatural enemy using both traditional and modern methods. The Bloodpack's costumes establish them as a military unit while preserving individual personalities. They wear dark tactical clothing, armor, boots, and specialized equipment appropriate for a team designed to hunt Blade. Their appearance immediately communicates preparation and professionalism. Yet small variations prevent them from becoming anonymous soldiers. Reinhardt's physical size and aggressive styling emphasize his confrontational personality, while Nissa's cleaner and more elegant appearance reflects her higher status within vampire society. Nissa's design is especially important because she occupies two worlds. She participates in dangerous field operations, but she is also the daughter of Damascenos. Her clothing therefore combines practical elements with a greater sense of refinement than most of the Bloodpack. She looks capable of fighting without losing the visual distinction of someone raised close to vampire power. As her relationship with Blade develops, this controlled appearance contrasts with the increasingly unstable world around her. Nomak is designed almost as the opposite of vampire elegance. Traditional vampires in the film often appear fashionable, organized, and physically attractive. Nomak looks damaged. His pale skin, visible veins, scars, and altered anatomy make his body itself appear like evidence of experimentation. He does not require elaborate clothing because the most important costume is effectively his transformed flesh. The Reapers extend this concept. Their horror comes from corrupted human and vampire anatomy rather than decorative monster design. Their pale appearance suggests sickness, while the splitting jaw destroys the familiar structure of the face. Makeup and prosthetic effects create physical textures that make them appear infected rather than magical. This supports the film's presentation of the Reaper condition as a biological catastrophe. Damascenos has a completely different visual identity. His appearance communicates age, authority, and physical separation from the warriors serving him. He is pale and almost fragile, yet everything around him communicates power. The contrast is deliberate. Reinhardt and the Bloodpack possess muscular physical strength, but Damascenos controls them through hierarchy, knowledge, and resources. His body does not need to look threatening because the environment performs that function for him. The sets reinforce these social divisions. Blade's headquarters resembles a combination of workshop, armory, garage, and bunker. Weapons and technology are openly visible because Blade's life revolves around preparation. The space feels functional rather than luxurious. Scud's presence adds a more improvised technological quality, with equipment suggesting constant modification and experimentation. Damasceno's headquarters communicates an entirely different form of power. The spaces are larger, more controlled, and more ceremonial. Ancient-looking architectural elements coexist with sophisticated laboratories and security systems. This combination tells the audience something essential about vampire civilization. It has survived for centuries not by rejecting modernity, but by absorbing it. The laboratory spaces are particularly important because they reveal the hidden reality beneath Damasceno's elegant authority. Clean scientific environments initially suggest intelligence and control, but they eventually become associated with unethical experimentation. The contrast between organized technology and the grotesque reapers produced by that technology supports one of the film's central themes. Civilization can conceal monstrous behavior. The House of Pain nightclub provides one of the movie's most memorable environments. It represents vampire society at its most confident and decadent. Crowds, music, darkness, artificial lighting, industrial textures, and provocative fashion create a space where vampires can gather away from ordinary human society. The location feels simultaneously fashionable and threatening. When the Reapers invade, the meaning of the set changes. The crowded layout that initially represents celebration becomes a trap. Darkness provides hiding places, loud music interferes with awareness, and large numbers of bodies make it difficult to identify the infected. The production design therefore participates directly in the action rather than functioning merely as decoration. Blade 2 was written by David S. Goyer, who had also written the first Blade and therefore understood the central character before the sequel began. His screenplay does not attempt to transform Blade into a talkative hero. Instead, the dialogue is built around his economy of words. Blade speaks when necessary, frequently answers threats with dry confidence, and rarely explains his emotions directly. This approach allows Wesley Snipes to communicate much of the character through expression, posture, timing, and physical presence rather than long speeches. The screenplay understands that Blade's dialogue works best when it sounds controlled. Other characters become angry, frightened, arrogant, or desperate, while Blade often remains calm. This creates humor without turning him into a comedian. When someone threatens him, the audience already suspects Blade is probably the most dangerous person in the room. His restrained responses therefore become more effective than elaborate insults would be. The script builds much of his charisma around the idea that Blade rarely needs to prove himself verbally because his actions will do it for him. This is immediately useful when the Blood Pack enters the story. They were trained specifically to hunt Blade, which creates an obvious source of conflict. Reinhardt in particular cannot tolerate being forced to cooperate with a man he considers an enemy. Their exchanges establish a contest of dominance before the real mission begins. Reinhardt talks aggressively because he wants to establish superiority. Blade responds with confidence because he does not believe Reinhardt possesses it. The explosive device Blade attaches to Reinhardt becomes a particularly effective piece of screenwriting because it functions as both a joke and a source of tension. The device remains part of their relationship throughout the film. Every time Reinhardt challenges Blade, the audience remembers that Blade appears capable of killing him immediately. This creates an ongoing power imbalance while giving their hostility a darkly comic quality. Whistler's dialogue provides a different kind of humor. His relationship with Blade is old enough that neither man needs to behave formally. Their conversations contain sarcasm, irritation, and familiarity. Whistler can criticize Blade in ways other characters cannot because their bond has already survived years of danger. The screenplay rarely makes them express affection openly. Their loyalty is communicated through behavior and through the freedom they have to insult or challenge one another. This becomes particularly useful when Whistler meets Scud. The two characters represent different generations of Blade's support system. Scud is younger, casual, technologically enthusiastic, and eager to appear comfortable around Blade. Whistler is suspicious, experienced, and unwilling to be impressed. Their verbal hostility creates comedy while quietly preparing the audience for the later betrayal. Scud's dialogue is deliberately different from Blade's. He speaks more casually and fills conversations with slang, jokes, and technical explanations. At first, this makes him seem approachable. He appears to be the ordinary personality, standing beside an almost mythic hero. When his betrayal is revealed, the same casual confidence becomes arrogance. He believes he has successfully deceived Blade and enjoys explaining the trick. The reversal works because Blade has already understood what happened. Rather than allowing Scud a triumphant betrayal speech, the script turns his confidence against him. Blade reveals that he knew Scud was compromised, transforming what appears to be the villain's victory into another demonstration of Blade's awareness. The scene is an example of how the screenplay uses dialogue to change who possesses power without requiring a physical fight. Nissa's dialogue serves a more emotional purpose. She begins with the controlled language expected from someone close to vampire leadership. Her conversations with Blade gradually become less formal as mutual respect develops. The screenplay avoids turning their relationship into a conventional romance. Attraction and sympathy are present, but they remain restrained by the reality that the characters belong to opposing worlds. This restraint makes Nissa's final request more effective. By the end, the audience understands what seeing the sunrise means for a vampire. The script does not need a lengthy speech explaining her decision. The emotional meaning comes from everything that has happened before it. Her choice to face daylight represents rejection of the future forced upon her by the Reaper infection and, indirectly, rejection of her father's world. Nomak receives relatively little dialogue compared with his importance, but that limitation strengthens him. He is introduced through physical horror, encouraging the audience to interpret him as a monster. As he begins speaking and demonstrating intelligence, the perception changes. Every piece of information reveals that his attacks have direction and purpose. The revelation that Nomak is connected to Damaskinos gives earlier scenes new meaning. His dialogue expresses resentment rather than simple hunger. The screenplay gradually shifts him from creature to tragic antagonist. This is essential because the final conflict becomes more interesting once audiences understand that Nomak did not create the situation. He is the result of someone else's experiment. The marketing of Blade 2 faced an unusual challenge when the film approached its March 2002 release. The original Blade had been successful, but the sequel was arriving in a rapidly changing comic book movie landscape. X-Men had demonstrated the growing commercial potential of Marvel characters, while Spider-Man was preparing to become one of the biggest releases of the year. Blade 2 therefore needed to remind audiences that this franchise occupied a very different corner of comic book cinema. Its advertising emphasized horror, martial arts, weapons, vampires, and Wesley Snipes rather than attempting to resemble a traditional superhero campaign. Wesley Snipes was naturally the center of the promotion. By the second movie, his interpretation of Blade had become the franchise's primary image. Posters and promotional material could immediately communicate the character through a few recognizable elements: black clothing, sunglasses, his sword, weapons, and Snipes' controlled expression. The marketing sold Blade as an established action icon rather than introducing him as an unfamiliar comic book hero. This distinction was important because many members of the general audience still did not strongly associate Blade with Marvel Comics. The films had built an identity that could stand independently from the source material. Promotional material could therefore appeal simultaneously to comic readers, horror fans, martial arts audiences, and people who simply enjoyed Wesley Snipes' action movies. That broad genre appeal was one of the sequel's greatest commercial advantages. The theatrical posters reflected this approach. Blade generally dominates the composition, with the supporting characters and supernatural threat positioned around him. Dark backgrounds, metallic imagery, weapons, and dramatic lighting communicate the movie's tone immediately. The design avoids bright superhero colors. Instead, the visual campaign resembles a combination of an action thriller and a horror movie. The tagline used prominently in the campaign, "Faster, Sharper, Deadlier," captured the sequel strategy in 3 words. It promised escalation. The first film had established Blade and his war against vampires. The second would increase the speed, danger, and violence. This was a straightforward but effective message for an audience already familiar with the character. Trailers similarly emphasized escalation. Rather than spending excessive time explaining Blade's history, they could present the central hook. Vampires now faced a new species of predator and needed Blade's assistance. The concept of Blade temporarily working alongside his enemies was easy to communicate and immediately created conflict. The Blood Pack added another promotional advantage because trailers could show several distinctive fighters instead of relying only on Blade and anonymous vampires. The Reapers were crucial to selling the horror element, although their most disturbing features worked best when not completely revealed. Promotional footage could suggest that something more dangerous than ordinary vampires had appeared while preserving some of the shocks surrounding their unusual anatomy. The idea that the hunters themselves had become prey provided the campaign with a simple and effective horror premise. Guillermo del Toro's involvement also gave the film credibility among genre enthusiasts. At the time, he was not yet the globally famous filmmaker he would later become, but viewers familiar with Kronos or The Devil's Backbone knew his interest in monsters and gothic storytelling. For mainstream advertising, however, Snipes and the action remained the more immediate selling points. Music became another major promotional tool. Blade 2 received a soundtrack built around collaborations between hip-hop performers and electronic artists and producers. This was more than incidental music associated with the film. It was designed as a commercial product with its own identity, connecting Blade to the club culture and aggressive musical style that already formed part of the cinematic character's image. The soundtrack brought together names including Ice Cube, Paul Oakenfold, Cypress Hill, Ronnie Size, The Crystal Method, Mos Def, Massive Attack, Busta Rhymes, Moby, Mystical, and others. The collaboration concept helped the album stand apart from an ordinary compilation. Hip-hop and electronic music were both major forces in youth culture, and combining them reflected the hybrid identity of Blade itself. Music videos and soundtrack promotion extended the movie's presence beyond trailers and cinema advertising. A person could encounter Blade 2 through music television, record stores, entertainment magazines, or radio-related promotion without actively following comic book films. This cross-promotion was particularly valuable in an era before social media became the central mechanism for maintaining constant public awareness of upcoming releases. That historical context makes the Blade 2 campaign very different from modern blockbuster marketing. There were no major official campaigns built around contemporary platforms such as Instagram, TikTok, or X. Promotion depended much more heavily on theatrical trailers, television commercials, printed posters, magazines, entertainment programs, websites, music channels, interviews, and physical promotional displays. The internet was increasingly important, but online movie marketing had not yet developed into the continuous social media cycle familiar today. Blade 2 also benefited from the growing DVD market. Home video had become enormously important to the long-term commercial life of genre movies. DVD releases could offer audiences more than the film itself through deleted scenes, production material, commentaries, documentaries, and other behind-the-scenes content. For fans of visual effects, creature design, martial arts, and filmmaking, these additions provided another reason to purchase rather than simply rent the movie. The home entertainment presentation also helped extend the visual branding of the theatrical campaign. Blade's face, sunglasses, sword, dark clothing, and the film's metallic visual language remained central. Physical DVD packaging became part of how movies maintained cultural visibility on store shelves, especially during a period when large home video sections were major parts of entertainment retail. Blade 2 becomes especially interesting when compared with the first Blade, the later Blade, Trinity, other vampire films, and Guillermo del Toro's subsequent work. Although all three films in the original Blade trilogy revolve around Wesley Snipes as the Daywalker, each has a noticeably different personality. Blade 2 stands apart because it takes the basic world established by the original and pushes it toward creature horror, while simultaneously increasing the martial arts, mythology, visual effects, and scale of the action. The first Blade, released in 1998, established the essential cinematic version of the character. It introduced Blade as a human-vampire hybrid who possesses vampire strengths without most of their weaknesses. Stephen Norrington's direction emphasized urban action, underground vampire culture, electronic music, and late 1990s visual style. Stephen Dorff's Deacon Frost represented a very different kind of antagonist from the villains who followed. Frost was ambitious, rebellious, charismatic, and determined to overthrow the older vampire hierarchy. Blade 2 does not attempt to repeat that conflict. Instead of giving Blade another ambitious vampire seeking greater power, it introduces a creature that threatens the entire vampire species. This changes the relationship between hero and enemy. In the first film, Blade's mission is straightforward. Vampires are predators and he hunts them. In the sequel, he must temporarily protect those same predators because the Reapers represent an even greater danger. Guillermo del Toro also brings a stronger monster movie sensibility. Norrington's Blade often resembles an urban action thriller with supernatural elements. Del Toro's sequel increasingly resembles a survival horror film. The Reapers hide in darkness, spread through infection, attack groups from unexpected directions, and possess disturbing biological adaptations. The Saw mission could almost function independently as a creature feature. The visual difference between the films is equally important. The original establishes the black leather, sunglasses, weapons, clubs, and industrial atmosphere that defines cinematic Blade. The sequel retains these elements but combines them with Del Toro's fascination with Gothic architecture, laboratories, unusual anatomy, machinery, and tragic monsters. The result feels simultaneously familiar and transformed. Blade 2 can also be compared with Blade Trinity, released in 2004. The third movie expands the cast around Blade and places greater emphasis on banter, comedy, and supporting heroes. Ryan Reynolds as Hannibal King and Jessica Biel as Abigail Whistler receive substantial attention, changing the balance that had previously kept Blade overwhelmingly at the center. Blade 2 contains humor, especially through Reinhard, Whistler, and Scud, but its underlying threat remains serious. Nomak is treated as frightening and tragic rather than as an opportunity for constant jokes. This tonal commitment is one reason many fans regard the second film as stronger than Trinity. Blade 2 allows moments of humor without allowing them to undermine the horror. The villains also reveal a major difference. Trinity introduces Dracula as the ultimate legendary vampire, reaching backward toward the origins of vampire mythology. Blade 2 moves in the opposite direction. Its threat represents the possible future of vampirism. Nomak is not an ancient monster awakened from history. He is the result of experimentation intended to create the next stage of vampire evolution. This makes Blade 2 unusually interested in biological horror. In many vampire films, transformation is mystical, romantic, or supernatural. Here it behaves almost like infectious disease. Reaper bites spread mutation, infected characters deteriorate, bodies are examined scientifically, and the heroes search for biological weaknesses. The movie therefore moves vampire mythology closer to outbreak cinema. Compared with Underworld, released the following year, Blade 2 shares several surface characteristics. Both feature secret supernatural societies, extensive black clothing, modern weapons, ancient rivalries, and highly stylized action. Yet their central heroes occupy different emotional positions. Underworld builds much of its story around supernatural politics and forbidden relationships. Blade 2 remains primarily a hunter narrative. Blade enters vampire politics only because they interfere with his mission. The film also differs significantly from the romantic vampire tradition. Its vampires may possess sophisticated social structures, but feeding is rarely presented as seductive. Blood is physical, dangerous, and frequently disgusting. The Reapers push this approach to its extreme. Their feeding mechanism removes almost all traditional elegance from the vampire image and replaces it with uncontrolled biological appetite. When compared with The Matrix, the influence of late 1990s and early 2000s action style becomes apparent. Black clothing, sunglasses, electronic music, martial arts, exaggerated physical movement, and digital effects appear in both cinematic worlds. Yet Blade had already established several of these characteristics in 1998, before The Matrix was released. Blade 2 therefore belongs to a broader period in which Western action cinema was absorbing influences from Hong Kong filmmaking, music videos, club culture, and rapidly developing computer effects. Donnie Yen's participation strengthens the connection to Hong Kong action cinema. Although his role as Snowman is limited, His involvement with the action choreography contributed to a movie where supernatural abilities are expressed through martial arts movement rather than only through computer-generated spectacle. Wesley Snipes' own martial arts background makes this approach particularly effective. Blade 2 can also be compared with Del Toro's Hellboy, released 2 years later. Both are comic book adaptations centered on supernatural outsiders who possess qualities associated with the monsters they fight. Blade is partly vampire but hunts vampires. Hellboy appears demonic but protects humanity from supernatural threats. Neither hero can be understood simply by looking at his biology. The similarities extend to the supporting world. Both films contain secret organizations, strange creatures, elaborate practical effects, unusual machinery, underground locations, and a director who often appears more fascinated by monsters than ordinary humans.